They kicked me out of my own home, thinking I was powerless. So I waited quietly until the night Teach Y hosted a grand charity event. Right when the cameras were rolling, I walked in. And the truth I revealed made their faces fall apart in seconds. Let me start with this: have you ever been so excited for something? Truly, childlike excited, only for someone to swoop in and ruin it simply because they can, because it gives them some twisted sense of power. That's exactly where I found myself on the morning of the biggest event of the season, the annual charity gala that the entire town seemed to orbit around like planets around a sun. And here's the part that still makes my eye twitch: the gala was being held inside the mansion I once called home, before I downsized, as my son and daughter-in-law like to phrase it. Even though I never asked to downsize, and certainly never intended to hand my life over like a set of keys in a rental office. That mansion had held my laughter, my secrets, my late-night whispers with my husband, my children's first steps. And yet somehow I'd become a guest in the very place my heart still lived. Everyone in town expected the gala to be a spectacle, the gowns that looked like they cost more than my first car, the shimmering lights draped from ceiling to floor, the ridiculous guest list filled with people who pretended not to know each other's scandals. And honestly, I was looking forward to it. I had pulled out a dress that made me feel like the best version of myself. A soft silver gown with gentle beading that caught the light just right. The kind of dress that doesn't just hang on your body but lifts your spirit. You know that feeling: you zip it up, glance in the mirror, and suddenly you stand taller, breathe deeper, and think, look out, world. I still got it. But right as I laid it on the bed to steam the last few wrinkles, I heard the click, click, click of heels approaching my room, sharp, aggressive, impatient. If heels could file noise complaints, Claire, my daughter-in-law, didn't knock. She never knocks. She just barged in like a self-appointed queen surveying land she didn't own. She picked up my dress by the hanger, squinted at it like it personally offended her, and let out a snort that dripped with judgment. "You're not seriously wearing this, right?" she asked, though it sounded more like an accusation than a question. I should have known then that something was coming, because Claire doesn't do casual remarks, she does declarations, verdicts, and subtle stabs coated in perfume. I opened my mouth to respond, but before my breath could even form a sentence, she grabbed the delicate fabric with both hands and, yes, I still replay it like a slow-motion horror movie. She ripped it straight down the middle. The sound of tearing silk is something you don't forget. It's sharp, violent, final. For a moment I couldn't move. I felt like I'd stepped out of my own body and was watching someone else stand there, holding the shreds of what had been a beautiful gown only seconds earlier. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't collapse, though a part of me wanted to sink into the floorboards and disappear. Instead, I felt myself go strangely still, like my soul had hit a pause button. And then, as if she needed to add insult to emotional injury, she leaned in close, her breath smelling faintly of mint and malice, and whispered, "You don't have money to enter this party, and you weren't invited." I blinked once, twice. Was she serious? Not invited. To the home I'd lived in for decades. To the place whose floors I could walk blindfolded because I knew every curve, every spot where the boards creaked, every corner where sunlight hit differently depending on the season. For a moment, I wondered if she was joking. Surely she had to be joking. But no, Claire doesn't joke. Humor requires warmth. I felt the words hit me like small, cold stones. She straightened up, satisfied, arrogant, as though she had accomplished something meaningful. Then she tossed what remained of my dress onto the bed, shredded, ruined, a crime scene of jealousy and insecurity, and strutted out with her chin lifted so high she nearly bumped into the doorframe. I stared down at the sliced fabric, my stomach twisting in a knot that wasn't just anger or sadness. It was disbelief, betrayal, humiliation, and something darker, something heavier. The gown had been more than fabric. It had been a symbol, a reminder of the woman I used to be before life got complicated and people I loved became strangers with familiar faces. Holding the ruined dress, I swallowed every emotion like a pill: pride, heartbreak, fury, all crushed into one bitter dose I didn't ask for. And yet, under all that pain, something else flickered quietly. Not rage, not defeat, but strategy. Because what Claire didn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine as she walked away feeling victorious, was that my silence wasn't surrender. It wasn't weakness, it was calculation. It was patience. It was the stillness before a storm. The universe, in its own dramatic style, already knew what was coming. And it was sitting back, warming up its popcorn, waiting for the scene where the villain realizes she picked the wrong woman to underestimate. And that moment was coming sooner than anyone expected. Even me. The evening of the gala arrived with the kind of elegance that makes your breath catch. The driveway glittered with an endless line of luxury cars, polished to the point you could see your own shock in their reflections. The kind of cars that look more like museum exhibits than vehicles meant to be driven. Guests stepped out draped in jewels and gowns that moved like water, and there I was, standing outside the mansion that used to be my home, wearing a simple navy dress I had tucked away for emergencies, and honestly, this absolutely qualified as an emergency. As I stood there smoothing the fabric nervously, a part of me felt painfully small, like I had been pushed into a corner of my own life. Rejection tugged at me. Embarrassment prickled my skin and shame pressed down on my shoulders. But underneath all that softness was something simmering. Anger, resilience, a slow boiling courage that felt like a pot about to overflow. I took a breath, straightened my posture, and began walking up the stone steps, each one echoing too loudly in my chest, like my heart was trying to signal Morse code through my ribcage. I hadn't even made it to the top before I saw Claire, my daughter-in-law, spot me from across the entrance like a hawk eyeing a mouse that refused to stay in its place. She strutted over in that exaggerated way she walks, chin high, shoulders back, believing she owned every inch of the driveway, even though the only thing she owns entirely is a drawer full of expired coupons and an ego 3 sizes too large. As she reached me, she plastered on the strangest smile, tight-lipped, sugary, the kind women use when they're pretending to be polite while actually sharpening emotional knives behind their backs. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, though the corners of her mouth remained painfully lifted. "I told you. You don't have money to enter. You're not on the list." She said it slow, like I was hard of hearing instead of tired of her. Then, as if rehearsed, she turned to the security guard stationed at the door, an enormous man whose job was to look intimidating and confused at the same time. And she waved a hand at him with the elegance of someone trying to land a small plane. "Can you escort her out? She's confused?" she said. She really said that, to my face, as if I wandered onto the property by mistake, instead of having lived there for decades before she even knew how to spell the word marriage. I felt laughter bubble up inside me. Not the joyful kind, but the kind that surfaces when something is so ridiculous, so incredibly pathetic that your body doesn't know how else to respond. I pressed my lips together to avoid letting it escape, because truly, the sight of Claire acting like the gatekeeper of a house she didn't even legally own would have been hilarious if it weren't so insulting. The security guard took one step toward me, unsure, and then everything shifted in an instant. From the top of the grand staircase inside the mansion, a figure appeared, slowly, steadily, like a scene from a movie where the music softens and the camera zooms in. Old James, the butler, the man who had served my late husband and me for more years than I could count. He knew me before Claire even existed in our family vocabulary. He knew the house's history, its secrets, its heartbeat. He had been there through anniversaries, celebrations, heartbreaks, and quiet evenings where life felt unbearably fragile. So when he saw me standing at the entrance, half-stranded, half defiant, his expression didn't flicker with surprise. No, instead, his face warmed into a wide, knowing smile. A smile that spoke in full sentences. A smile that said, "I've been waiting for this moment." A smile that made me feel, for the first time in a long while, seen, understood, respected. Claire noticed his smile and stiffened so quickly that her collarbone actually twitched. But I wasn't looking at her anymore. My eyes stayed on James, because in that split second, something electric happened, something I can only describe as the universe gently tapping me on the shoulder and whispering, "Hold on, sweetheart, it's showtime." My breath steadied, my heartbeat slowed, and a calm washed over me, one of those rare, beautiful moments where you realize the ground you lost might actually still be beneath your feet. James descended the staircase with deliberate grace, his white gloves reflecting the chandelier lights, his steps measured like he was counting down to something significant. I stood still, rooted, waiting. And as he approached the doorway, guests inside began turning, watching, whispering, wondering who he was walking toward, who was important enough for the butler to greet personally in the middle of the gala. Claire shifted beside me, suddenly fidgeting with her bracelet, her confidence leaking out of her like a balloon losing air. Because even she understood what it meant when James smiled like that. Something was happening. Something she didn't control. Something she couldn't manipulate. The air thickened with anticipation. Mine, the crowds, even the mansions itself. As though the walls remembered me and were holding their breath for what came next. And I realized then, standing on those steps, looking at the man who had served my family faithfully for a lifetime, that maybe I hadn't come to the wrong place at all. Maybe I had come exactly where I was meant to be. Inside the mansion, everything shifted the moment I stepped through the doorway. Like the walls themselves straightened their posture because they remembered me, remembered my laughter, my footsteps, my seasons of joy and grief within them. The music softened into a gentle hum, the kind that forces people to lower their voices and lean in. The crowd hushed just enough that I could hear glasses clinking, tiny echoes bouncing off the marble floors. 100 wealthy whispers fluttered around the ballroom like startled birds, all carrying curiosity, gossip, and that delicious anticipation people get right before something dramatic unfolds. And let me tell you, this was the perfect moment for a twist. It felt like one of those movie scenes where the camera pauses on a grand staircase and everyone turns, waiting for the star to walk in. Suddenly, old James, steady, calm, dignified, stepped to the very top of that staircase. His white gloves gleamed beneath the chandelier lights, and for a moment, he looked like a conductor preparing to cue an orchestra. He lifted his hand slowly, deliberately, with the grace of someone who had served this home and its history far longer than Claire or Ethan had even known it existed. And then, in a voice that carried through every corner of the ballroom, louder and clearer than I had ever heard him speak, he announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, the owner of this mansion has just arrived." The room froze. Not a whisper, not a breath, not a clink. It was as if everyone's lungs collectively agreed to stop working. I watched Claire spin around so fast I genuinely worried her neck might file a protest with HR. Her eyes were wide, her mouth hanging open, like she had just witnessed a ghost rise from the floorboards. My son Ethan, he nearly choked on his champagne and had to hold onto the banister like the truth had physically knocked him backwards. "Owner," he shouted, his voice cracking like a teenager discovering heartbreak for the first time. "This mansion is ours." And then, even louder, as if the words themselves were betraying him, "It elbuis was." Their faces were priceless, truly a moment that, if I could have taken a picture, I'd have framed above my fireplace. They turned pale, the exact shade of unbaked dough, their expressions a combination of confusion, terror, and that special kind of embarrassment people feel when they realize they've been confidently, loudly, publicly wrong. Have you ever seen someone experience competence in real time? It's magical. The whispers erupted immediately. "Owner. What does he mean? I thought the house was transferred. Didn't the son take over?" The assumptions people make when they're too busy admiring the exterior to understand the foundation. Because no, the house was never transferred. Not legally, not emotionally, not in any way that mattered. My late husband, God rest his stubborn, brilliant soul, left the entire property in my name, solely mine, with explicit instructions that I alone controlled it until the day I chose otherwise, and I never chose otherwise. But Ethan and Claire, in their arrogance, assumed that once they convinced me to downsize, the mansion naturally became theirs by default, like a spare sweater someone forgot to take home. They never checked the will. They never asked. They never verified. They just took. The joke, oh the beautiful poetic joke, was entirely on them. Claire's mouth opened and closed, like a fish desperately gasping for words it didn't know how to form. You said you sold it," she hissed at Ethan, betrayal dripping from her voice. I thought she did," Ethan stammered, turning the same shade as the table linens. And truly, the beauty of watching two people realize that neither of them had ever bothered to check the legal documents they were so sure of. Chef's kiss. I stepped forward slowly, my heels tapping against the polished floor in a rhythm that echoed through the room. With each step, I felt something heavy shedding from my shoulders, pieces of myself I had lost to guilt, to silence, to letting others take control of my story. Step by step, I reclaimed my space, my dignity, my history, my voice. When I reached the top of the staircase beside James, he gave me a subtle nod, one that said, "It's yours now." The room's attention was fixed entirely on me. Every eye, every whisper, every held breath. I let the silence stretch, savoring the moment, grounding myself in the truth of it. Then I looked out at the crowd, at the chandeliers, at the home that never stopped belonging to me, and I said, calm and clear, "Thank you, everyone, for coming." My voice didn't tremble. It didn't waver. It carried. And then I turned my gaze, slowly, purposefully, toward Claire. "And thank you, Claire," I added, letting her name hang like a weight between us, "for reminding me exactly why I needed to come home tonight." A wave of murmurs washed across the ballroom. Faces softened into admiration. Smirks formed among the guests who had always suspected something was off. And then applause broke out, genuine applause, warm and welcoming, the kind that made my spine straighten just a little more. Claire swayed on her feet, her complexion chalk white, her ego deflating by the second. Ethan looked like he wanted to crawl underneath one of the buffet tables and live there permanently. For a moment, I stood at the top of the stairs, letting the applause surround me, letting the truth settle into the walls. Once more, I hadn't lost my home. I had simply reclaimed it. After the shock of the announcement settled into the marble floors of the ballroom, everything around me seemed to click into place like the final pieces of a puzzle I didn't even realize I'd been building all along. And suddenly the night felt lighter, brighter, almost deliciously poetic, because when you own the house, when your name is the one carved into the will, into the deed, into the very foundation, well, you get to decide how the evening ends. I stepped toward the microphone with a calmness that surprised even me, my gown sweeping across the floor like I had been waiting my whole life for this moment. And as the chatter died down and a soft silence filled the glittering room, I gave the crowd a warm smile and said, "Thank you all for being here for the charity tonight. This evening is about giving and apparently a little bit about education as well." Soft laughter rolled across the ballroom like a wave, the kind that tells you people are relieved the tension has broken, but also secretly thrilled to witness a real-life plot twist unfold in front of them. And that's when I gently leaned in, letting my voice take on that steady tone mothers use when they're tired of nonsense but still polite enough to wrap the truth in silk. As the legal and rightful owner of this estate, I continued, letting my eyes drift briefly, oh so briefly, to Claire, who was sweating so hard she might as well have been standing under a waterfall. "I'd like to make it very clear that any guest who attempts to sabotage or humiliate others tonight." A pause, a raised brow, the dramatic timing of a woman who has lived long enough to know exactly when to twist the knife and when to simply set it on the table. "Will be escorted out." The applause that followed was loud, immediate, and wonderfully satisfying, the kind that made even the chandelier seem to shimmer with approval. Claire looked like she might faint directly into the chocolate fountain. Ethan looked like his entire childhood had just flashed before his eyes in slow motion, and James, lovely, loyal old James, gave a subtle nod to security, the kind of nod that quietly reminded everyone that the house was no longer a kingdom run by two self-appointed royals, but a home restored to its rightful queen. As the party resumed, albeit with a completely different energy, Ethan approached me with the hesitant steps of a child walking toward a consequence he wasn't sure he deserved but definitely earned. His eyes were red, not from sadness, but from the weight of realization pressing down on him like a truth he could no longer dodge. "Mom, why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice cracking just slightly. Barely enough to notice, but enough for me to hear the boy he used to be before entitlement crept in. I looked at him gently and said, "Because I was waiting to see how you'd treat me when you thought I had nothing." He opened his mouth like he wanted to argue, to defend himself, to say something, anything, that might justify the months of disrespect, dismissal, and careless cruelty. But for the first time in a very long time, he said absolutely nothing, and that silence, that heavy, echoing silence, felt like the first brick being laid in a bridge we might someday rebuild, slowly, carefully, if he learned how to approach it with humility instead of pride. Claire, on the other hand, kept her distance. She paced, muttered under her breath, clutched her purse like it contained the last oxygen tank on Earth, and avoided eye contact with anyone who might ask her how it felt to be publicly outmaneuvered by the woman she had been subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, pushing aside for months. I didn't bother approaching her, not out of spite, but because some lessons don't require a lecture. Sometimes the truth simply sits in the room with you, louder than any words you could speak, and while the two of them wrestled with panic and embarrassment, I let myself enjoy the evening for the first time in what felt like forever. I spoke with guests, real guests, not people tolerating me because they assumed I was some fragile old mother being kept around for obligation and optics. I danced a little, laughed more than I expected, and allowed myself to feel the warm, glowing reminder that I am still a woman with worth, with dignity, with strength, with a history and a future that belong entirely to me, regardless of who tries to shrink or dismiss it. The music hummed around me like a victory song I never asked for but deeply appreciated, and as I watched the guests raise their glasses, laugh freely and celebrate the charity event without tension, I felt a strange, beautiful clarity wash over me. I had been pushed aside, ignored, underestimated, not because I was weak but because some people only recognize value when it benefits them. And when they think it's gone, they treat you like you're invisible. But here's the truth I want every woman in this world, every mother, every grandmother, every person who has ever been told they don't matter, to hear. Sometimes the universe waits, silent and patient, for the perfect moment to flip the lights back onto you, and when it does, the brilliance can be blinding. I stood there in my own home, surrounded by people who were finally seeing me, not the version filtered through my son's assumptions or my daughter-in-law's insecurities, but the real me. And I felt something inside me settle, like a lock clicking into place. This was my house, my life, my story. And I had taken it back without screaming, without begging, without lowering myself to their level. I simply stood tall and told the truth. So let me ask you, have you ever been pushed aside so someone else could shine? Because maybe, just maybe, the moment you think your light has faded is actually the moment it's about to blind everyone who doubted you. And as the clock ticked past midnight, the echoes of applause still vibrating through the walls, I realized something: the takeover they never expected wasn't about the mansion at all. It was about me reclaiming myself. Make sure to subscribe to the channel for more real stories, emotional twists, and powerful moments just like this one. Your support helps us bring more stories to life. Stories that remind us we're stronger than people think. Hit that subscribe button, and let's keep going together.